So I think it's really about owning our faith. I think too often I was too comfortable allowing people to tell me what I believe instead of actually understanding why I believe what I believe. And that's one thing that my education has helped me with, is understanding there's great proof, evidence for what we believe. We do not have blind faith. We have a faith that is based on tremendous amount of evidence. And the world out there will tell us we have no evidence. Well, what we're going to do in here is we're going to talk about the evidence, and there is lots of it. So, but I did want to start, and then I'll ask if you have any questions. One thing you got to remember, especially in today's world, there's a difference between church traditions and what actually is in the Bible. And the skeptics and the critics out there take advantage of this, because many of our traditions are not biblically laid out. And if you don't educate yourself, when someone says that to you, you can be really shocked. And I'm just going to give you a couple examples you probably already know. This is a picture from the Encyclopedia Britannica of St. Paul. And I don't know about you, but I always heard the story that Paul the oppressor was miraculously, Jesus changed his name to Paul from Saul on the road to Damascus, right? I heard that all, growing up, it was just not one of those normal things. And that was in Acts chapter 9, where Saul falls from his horse, he sees Jesus, he's made blind, and then Ananias comes to him, and that's the beginning of his conversion. But in Acts chapter 13, he's still Saul. So, and this is the excerpt, Acts chapter 13, verse 9. Then Saul, who is also called Paul, filled with the Holy Spirit, looked at him intently. And this is the one place in Acts where you see both names. And the story is Barnabas and Paul are on Cyprus, and they are confronted by a sorcerer. And if you know the story, Paul prays and makes him blind. And there's a really amazing story that goes on. But this is the point in the book of Acts where Paul becomes Paul. Actually, up until this point, he's referred to as Saul all the way along. So the story we've heard of the miraculous name change, well, it could be true. It's not recorded in the Bible that way. It's actually more likely that Paul is his Greek or Roman name, and Saul is his Hebrew name. And I'll give you an example. Walter, what's your Chinese name? So why do you use Walter? Make life easy for other people. Or for me, because I know his name and I can't pronounce it. I've tried. And I think it's more likely that's exactly the story with Saul and Paul. When he's in the Greek culture, he's probably Paul. He might have even been born Paul. But when he's around Hebrew people, he was Saul, because Saul is a Hebrew name. It's even possible that when he went to study under Gamaliel in Jerusalem, if he'd had a Greek name, they would have wanted him to have a Hebrew name. So we don't know. But it's one of those church traditions, and someone throws out, oh, that's not in the Bible. You go, yeah, it's not in the Bible. It could be true. And all of a sudden they're like, there's no fuel for their conversation. And I think knowing that it's a church tradition and not a biblical fact helps you, because it doesn't change our faith in any way. Another one, you guys are going to not like me for this one. This one, the Christmas Nativity. And I love the Christmas Nativity. Don't get me wrong. We had one that looked almost like this when I was a kid. But there's a lot wrong with this picture. Do you guys know how much is wrong with this picture? I mean, you start with the three kings, who probably came 2 years later. They're definitely not at the birth of Jesus. And then there's animals in the stable. Well, the shepherds are in the field by night with their flocks, which means it's spring or summer, which means the animals are outside. They're not in the barn. And then it's obviously not December because, again, the sheep are in the fields, which they wouldn't have been in the wintertime. And then the manger, a manger doesn't, that looks like a bassinet. A manger is a feeding trough, right? And then the one you really won't like me for is the word inn is not in the Greek. It's house. And there's no mention of a stable anywhere in the biblical story. It's beautiful church tradition, but recognizes church tradition. And yes, it is. And the angel's right there, right? They're, like I said, it's beautiful. We understand what it represents. But it also gives the critics an opportunity to cast doubts, especially at people that are new Christians. So I think it's really important to educate people that, yes, we're representing something with this. This is not meant to be the story. And I think too often it gets, I was shocked to find out the wise men came 2 years later. Okay, that really, or I did a word study and found out the word in is not in the Greek. That was very troubling for me. But I think if we just educated people, it becomes nothing because it doesn't impact anything that we believe in any way. Now you guys are really not going to like the next one, but I'll just show you one. Jesus, the name above all names. Do you guys know this one? Well, Jesus isn't a Hebrew name. Jesus was born Yeshua. So the name above all names is Yeshua. Do you know somebody else in the Bible whose name was Yeshua? This one hurts. Joshua, the leader of Israel after Moses, is Joshua. The English translation of the word Yeshua is Joshua. And how we got Jesus is very complicated. I'm not going to go into it because you can spend an hour on that conversation. It was several languages and some transliterations and letters that are feminine instead of masculine in one language, and you end up with Jesus. But we all know who we're talking about when we talk about Jesus, so it's no big deal. But again, skeptics and critics use this kind of stuff against us. It's like, well, it's not that. Well, yeah, but we know who we're talking about, right? So it's no big deal. But I think we need to educate ourselves on these things, or we can be surprised, or maybe even it can cast doubts in our own minds about what the truth really is. So that's really what this is going to be about. Any questions? You guys are so quiet. And I'm way off my notes. I don't even know where I'm at. Sorry.
When you were talking about the 3 kings, there was some stuff on Facebook about why people should not take down their Christmas decorations until the 6th of January. And people were asking why. When you go back and research it, they were saying that the wise men came to see Jesus on the 6th day. Which if they didn't, it might have been the 6th day 2 years later.
2 years later.
People don't realize that. And then they said once the wise men came to see Jesus, then Christmas was over. That was their guideline for taking down stuff on the 6th. That's the craziest thing I heard.
Yeah. Yeah, there's so many there's so many interesting things about the story, because if you believe the wise men came from Chaldea, which is most likely, probably Susa, because that's where Daniel was, that's where they would have had the scriptures. It takes them months to get to Judea from there, following the Fertile Crescent. So yeah, I mean, it's one of those things. It's like we don't even know what day Jesus was born on, or what year. Everybody, it was 0. It's like, no, it's probably like 3, maybe 5, even 8 BC. We don't know, because it depends on your history and when that census took place, which is a little cloudy in history. There are a lot of contested views, and it's not important. But what's important is to not be dogmatic about it. When people say, oh, but you guys think this, but that's not true. And it's like, well, you could be right. And go ahead. Mm.
And the time of year is right. It would be about September. And came a tabernacle among us.
Oh, that'd be beautiful if it was true. And it could be. It's just, the thing is, these nuances are not important to our core of what we believe. So knowing that there's some ripples as to what the truth is, actually is somewhat good. And it does allow us to kind of address things that people use against us as Christians, because there's a lot of atheists out there, and I'll talk about some like Bart Ehrman, who's an expert New Testament scholar who's an atheist, and he uses these kind of things against Christianity to prove it's not true, and he's totally misuse of the evidence, but he has an agenda, obviously. So our priority and the kind of the idea of doing this series is to really focus on what effective communication looks like. I mean, God's called us to go, reach, and teach, which means we have to be effective in our communication of what we believe. And to be effective in any form of communication takes three things. It takes knowledge, it takes application, and it takes character. And what I mean is, knowledge is, you got to know what you're talking about if you're going to go talk about it, obviously. Application is, you got to know how to apply that knowledge in a way that your audience can actually understand. The words I use in this forum are very different than if I went to a kindergarten class, or if I'm overseas in a country that doesn't speak English first. You have to apply that knowledge in a way that your audience can understand. And then character, obviously how you present it matters. And that's the one we all struggle with the most. But in here, for this series, we're going to concentrate on the knowledge part. And then if you guys are interested, we'll move on to the application part maybe later in the year. There's some books that have great techniques on how to apply things. And then the character, you're on your own. I'm a work in progress myself. Only God can help your character, so we'll grow on that one together. But our purpose is so we can be more effective communicators of the gospel. And how you do that is building that foundation of knowledge, not just with the Bible, but with everything else. Because the Bible's perfect for telling us how we're supposed to live. But for people that don't believe in the Bible, we can't use the Bible. So can we show them that God is real without using the Bible? And that's what I'm going to try to show you the most during this series. We'll talk very little about the Bible other than when we're talking about the reliability of the Bible. But what I want to show you is there's so much evidence. I mean, the world is just amazing. Science is amazing. And just to give you a taste, this is what the sessions are going to look like. Next week, we're going to talk about worldview. And if you don't know what worldview is it's kind of the principles that you live by. It's what dictates your behavior in the world. And if you're not really clear what your worldview is, as far as how you would answer what they call the existential questions, then you're going to be swayed by what you hear on the TV or what you read in a newspaper. And as Christians, we want to make sure our worldview is rooted in what God said, but out there they don't have that. And there are some very unusual worldviews. And so what we'll do is we'll go through 6 of the predominant worldviews, which encompass most of the world's religions, and see how they answer those existential questions, and then show how they can't live out what they say they believe. And getting a little bit of that background is the reason it's important, and as kind of the foundational step with talking to people, is when I use a word, and when you hear it, you might not hear what I mean, even though it's the same word, because words have lots of different meanings. And when you start talking about cross-cultural, or definitely cross-religion, sometimes we use exactly the same terms, religion to religion, and they mean completely different things. And so we have to kind of understand who we're talking to if we're going to be effective communicators. And one way is being able to ask the right questions so you understand what their perspective is. Because if you don't know the perspective, you can be, espousing about the good news and they think you're talking about Allah or something. So it's important for us to kind of get a basis on worldview. And that's one thing I learned in seminary I had no idea about was worldview. And it's amazingly helpful to spend a little time on that. So we'll spend next week on that. We'll go through a whole bunch of scenarios. I hope it'll be fun. Next, people don't believe in truth anymore. They'll talk about your truth, my truth. Truth is relative. That's a bunch of hooky, right? I mean, it's not true. And there are some really logical ways to walk through to show that there can only be one truth, okay? And I think having examples in your mind where they're fresh and ready when someone presents you with something like this is really useful. So we'll walk through some of those things just so if you were meeting an atheist and they're going to sit down and talk to you and they're open to having a conversation, this is kind of the roadmap of how you would work them forward. If someone's more advanced in their understanding, then you'd start at a different place. So is there a God? Believe it or not, there's Christians that are sitting in our pews that aren't sure if there's a God. And there's some great arguments. for why there is a God. None of those evidences will point you to the God of Christianity for sure, but I like what they call the cumulative approach to things. And it's this idea that, where's my little stone? You have arguments, and you think of a teeter-totter, and each argument goes on one side of the teeter-totter until everything points in one direction. And the evidence for God is kind of like that. There's no one evidence that everybody is going to look at and say, oh, that's it. Everybody's going to have a different one that kind of speaks to them. That's the reason to learn all of them. But as you put each one in somebody's shoe, it becomes to the point where, well, there's really only one explanation or one option. And there's only one truly livable worldview, and that's the Christian worldview, which we'll talk about next time. And then we'll talk about, can you trust the Bible? And there are a lot of Christians that struggle with this. Is the Bible reliable? We'll talk about reliability of the Bible and why it's reliable, inerrancy, Bible translations, and original language stuff, which should be kind of fun. We'll have a couple of exercises with that, especially since we have multiple languages represented in the room. That will make it a lot more fun. But we'll spend a couple weeks going through that, and if you have any doubt if the Bible's reliable, you won't, because the evidence is so overwhelming. It's kind of amazing. But it's good to have it on your mind, so when somebody throws out, oh, what about those Old Testament problems when they killed all those people? Well, there's really good evidence for why that happened. And then we'll get to the one that is the atheist's best argument, the problem of evil. And they'll use this one. But I promise you, when we get done, there won't be any problem with evil anymore. It's our problem with bad, but not evil. And I'll explain why. I really appreciate some of the perspectives that I learned because I'd never thought of it that way. And once you hear it, it's like, oh yeah, this is actually an argument for God, not against God. And then we'll talk about the historical Jesus. And I don't know how many of you know the historical documentation for Jesus, but it is amazing. There's more historical documentation for the life of Jesus than any other historical figure from the 4th century earlier, overwhelmingly. And this is not just in the Bible, this is outside of the Bible. And then it's amazing how many people want to deny the resurrection. And there's some really kooky theories on this. But if you haven't been exposed to the theory before, when someone first tells it to you, you're like, well, it knocks you off. So what I want to do is kind of expose you to some of those theories and why they're stupid, and how you can rebuttal those arguments in a way that might be that stone in the shoe for that person that holds that view. And then we'll get to the one I like, which is the science in the Bible. And I hope you guys like it as much as I do, because the Bible is not a science book, but there's so much science in the Bible. In fact, as we discover more and more in science, the Bible more and more. We'll talk about archaeology, and then we'll take on naturalism, which is the common one, and it should be fun. And then we'll see what we're going to do with the last session, because basically what your questions and comments are, and then we'll see what we're going to do from there. Okay? All right, so the idea is this is going to fit together like a puzzle. Think of this as your worldview, and your opinion on each one of these things and your knowledge each one kind of builds that worldview so you can stand up to whatever the world is thrown at you. Is it? Okay. So that's kind of the intent of the sessions. And you're not going to hear me all the time, I promise. We're going to listen to some other much smarter people than me as we go through. One of them is John Lennox. And if you don't know does anybody know who John Lennox is other than my family? Well, you got to get to know this guy. John Lennox is... Did you? No one responded. John is he's the most credentialed, probably the most credentialed Christian ever, okay? I got to get his degrees right, so let me find myself on my notes here. He has a master's degree and a PhD in bioethics from Oxford, a doctorate degree in science and mathematics from Surrey, a master's and a PhD from Cambridge, and a whole bunch of other degrees. He's the most well-read person. When you listen to him talk, you're like, wow, this guy he's the real deal. And he has debated most of the atheists out there. And if you like that kind of thing, just get on YouTube and search John Lennox and whatever atheists you know of, Christopher Hitchens or Richard Dawkins or Sam Harris or whoever, and listen to his debates. It's very entertaining. So I'll have a few little clips from John Lennox. Another guy you've already heard from is C.S. Lewis. You guys know C.S. Lewis. Another reason to like John Lennox, he was once a student of C.S. Lewis when he was at Oxford. So if you needed another reason to love John Lennox, C.S. Lewis is probably it. But C.S. Lewis, the way he writes puts things that are really complex into really simple terms, and it sticks in your head the way he writes things. So we'll hear from C.S. Lewis, as you already have. Lee Strobel, I'm sure most people know The Case for Christ, so we'll hear from him. J. Warner Wallace, anybody know this guy? If you like detective stories, this is your guy. He was a cold case detective in Los Angeles. He's been featured on Dateline. He was in the movie God Not Dead. And he uses his detective techniques to prove the resurrection, to prove the authenticity of the Bible. And if you like that kind of thing, he's your guy. I love listening to Warner Wallace. Another is James Tour. Anybody know James Tour? He's from right here in town. He's a professor here at Rice University. He's taken on the origin of life researchers in recent years and basically called them out as fraudulent. Is the fact that they always claim that they've created life in the laboratory. It's so not true. The origin of life people, which is a multi-billion-dollar-year activity. He's just been named the head of the National Science Foundation, which is an amazing thing. He is. If you have questions about the origin of life type thing, he's the guy you want to go to. He's a chemist, so sometimes it's a little technical. I love it because I'm a chemist, but if you want something that's a little more less technical, Stephen Meyer is a really good one. The Discovery Institute. His expertise is the idea of intelligent design and countering the evolutionary perspective. Another is Tim Keller. Tim Keller was a Presbyterian pastor up in Boston. He died recently of cancer, but he is a New York. His way of presenting ideas is really disarming. He believed you should always know all the criticisms against your perspectives and all the alternative views, and you should present those when you're teaching so that you're not indoctrinating somebody in something. And what he means is, well, if I teach you something and I didn't share that there's an alternative, and then you go out there in the world and you learn the alternative, now all of a sudden it looks like I was holding something back from you, and it can cause doubts. And his techniques are really good. I'll be using some of those techniques just because I really like them. Gary Habermas. If you want to know something about the resurrection of Christ, this is your guy. He's probably the expert on all the evidences and the arguments against the alternative theories. He also has done a lot of research on near-death experiences, so if that's something you're interested in, he's your guy. I'll share this with you. Norman Geisler is another one. I think Geisler wrote like 100 books, maybe 90 books. He's the one I would go to if someone's challenging you about the inerrancy of the Bible. He has a way of explaining what that really means. It doesn't mean word for word accurate in our English Bibles. What it means is thought, and he is kind of the guy to look up. And like I say, he's written lots of books. William Lane Craig is probably the most prolific debater of the Christian apologists. He's written like 120 books, and he's the guy that if you don't want to hear the technical explanation, you want something that is more not scientist, he's your guy. He can explain the case for the resurrection, the case for truth, the case for God in ways that are really simple and straightforward, and you can share his talking points with anybody. And then Frank Turek, who's one of my personal favorites. He's a retired Air Force guy, and again, he's very funny. If you've never listened to him, he's worth listening to, and he can make something that seems really technical, really lighthearted, and he's really technically sound. He actually studied under Norman Geisler. Greg Kokel, who we'll talk about a little bit, his key is he has this technique about asking questions and letting somebody unravel their own perspectives. And it's non-threatening, it's non-aggressive, but it's a great technique. And actually, if you guys are interested, when we're done with this course, we might do a couple weeks on one of his books, because his tactics book is just amazing. And then Michael Laconin is a Christian historian, probably the best of our time. Daniel Wallace is ancient manuscripts, especially in the New Testament. He's just the guy. He's up here at Dallas. And then you'll hear from a couple of my seminary professors, Jonathan Pritchett and Braxton Hunter, throughout the series. So these are just some of the guys that we're going to be dealing with. So you know you're not just going to hear from me. So but if you have a specific topic that you're interested in, let me know, and then maybe I can point you toward one of these guys, because they each have an expertise and a strength in how they present. So apologetics, it's a terrible word. Let me just let John Lennox explain what apologetics is.
Sometimes I think people feel a bit put off by the word apologetics. They think that's for kind of very professional experts, or they think it maybe sounds like apologizing. But what is apologetics?
Well, it's not apologetics. The word is a disaster, because it's a transliteration. Straight from Greek apologia becomes in English apologetics. But if they translated the word, it means defense. And Peter puts it brilliantly, the apostle. He said, always be ready to give a defense, an apologia, to anyone who asks you a reason for the hope that's within you. Now, I find that fascinating. I've actually written a little book about it called Have No Fear.
So it's just a taste. You guys want to take a break?